Hey, Jermaine, how are you? Good. Normal crowd here. How are you? Regular crowd, yeah. I guess so, yeah. We have the same title. Oh, yeah, Doug and I have the same title, so. But you're better looking. Much better. And just better company too. Yeah, just better company. Yes, sir. Ready to go.
Good morning, everybody. Call the meeting to order. Thanks for coming this morning. In terms of the roll call, we have 5 members of the sports authority present. And the finance. We have a busy agenda this morning, and we'd like to work. So to preview, the focus is on a few topics. First of all, we are going to set up some agreements and mechanisms to allow costs to be spent, costs that will be spent to be reimbursed. We're going to start the process seeking to issue a municipal bond by at least voting on the possible authorization of PFM as a financial consultant. Cass Berry, a law firm, as a consultant. And then we would then vote on authorizing PFM to issue a RFP for underwriting services. We will also look at authorizing giving the sports authority the ability to hire external legal advice to advise us on specific issues on housing cases. So those are the decisions we need to make today. Those are the votes that we cast. But we also want to have some discussion topics. One is to begin a discussion about the lease agreement and primary documents when lease. We do not yet have a lease. We're not being asked to approve a lease yet, but we want to begin the process of educating the sports authority members about stadium leases in general and about some of the specifics of what could be leases. We also want to discuss some committee assignments. The sports authority will operate as a committee as a whole. So these committees will not meet independently. But we would like to ask members of the sports authority to express interest in heading committees focused on 3 areas. Committee heads would help lead our discussion on litigation topics. In terms of other business, the city staff has sent around a packet of information about the project to all the sports authority members to help educate them. We want to spend some time discussing that packet. We want to spend some time seeing if members have any questions about that. We want to make sure that the members of the sports authority have as much information as possible as they begin their work. In terms of the minutes, as noted in the agenda, the minutes of the first meeting on August 30th will be presented at the September 29th meeting. So I guess we'll do 2 sets of minutes.
Lisa, I think there's been a summary that's been sent around at this point of what they heard at the last meeting, and that full transcript should be available.
So why don't we jump right into the agenda? We will discuss first Roman numeral 3, a resolution declaring the intent of the sports authority of the county of Hamilton and the city of Chattanooga to reimburse itself for certain expenditures in the aggregate principal amount of not to exceed $80 million with proceeds of bonds or other debt obligations issued by the authority. I move that we discuss that. Is there a second? And staff, before we begin the discussion, it'd be great if you could just provide some background on this item.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jermaine Freeman, Economic Development from the City of Chattanooga. So this resolution essentially allows the Sports Authority to begin to reimburse itself, to have the ability to reimburse itself for some of the work that the Sports Authority will incur over the next few months as part of the process of preparing to build a stadium. And so the Sports Authority will have the ability to potentially reimburse itself from the bond issuance. The bond issuance is not expected for another few months, but in the immediate future, we have some initial work that should begin in terms of geotechnical work, environmental work, as well as expenses that may arise from working with the financial advisor, as well as working with legal counsel. So this allows the Sports Authority to sort of have a funding stream that will allow itself to be reimbursed when bonds are eventually issued.
And I guess, Jermaine, for some reason, it's not issued in the city.
That is correct. And if it's okay with the board, I'll have Mr. Mamantov clarify this resolution versus the other.
Good morning. It's great to see you all. Just to clarify, this first resolution is purely for federal tax purposes. And as your chair knows, I tend to get in the weeds a little bit, but just to, there's a history that the IRS does not like people to do what's called pyramid bonds. In other words, this beautiful building that we're in, the claim that Brent can now refinance it 50 years later. So they make you put something in the record to say you intend to finance things so that you don't claim that 2 or 3 or 5 years from now that, oh, we meant to finance that. So this resolution is purely for federal tax purposes to make the IRS happy someday. The other resolution that you're going to get to later is because you all have no cash in the bank, obviously, until you do issue bonds, the city is going to need to advance funds for like geotech and things like that. They can't really site the stadium until they do some environmental testing and to do some surveying. And so to be able to have those funds available to pay that expense, there's a second resolution with a very simple reimbursement agreement that says that the city can advance funds to pay those expenses. And then if and when you're all able to issue bonds, then you can reimburse the city. If you are never able to issue bonds, you'll not have any money to pay back the city, and they understand that. But that is the game plan. I just wanted to make sure you understood why there's 2 different resolutions on there.
Yes, sir. That is the reason that you've got the official intent under the Treasury reg in this resolution. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, exactly.
And that allows us to be a nonprofit entity that is at least recognizing this as the official intent of this board.
Yes, it doesn't go to our nonprofit status. This goes just purely, those Treasury regs are what's called the reimbursement regulations that basically say we intend to reimburse ourselves for any expenditures we incur until we issue bonds.
Yes, sir. And we are going to be a nonprofit, correct?
You're a public nonprofit corporation. If you want to, some people, I'm sorry if I'm getting a little tangential, but you're not a 501c3. You're not a 501c6. You are a governmental entity, which is exempt from taxation under Section 115 of the Internal Revenue Code, just like the city of Chattanooga or Hamilton County. So you're exempt like all those types of entities.
Just like to get that on the record. No
Yes.
problem. All right. Thank you.
Any questions any other questions from members?
Can you remind us of the timeline, the expected timeline of when bonds would be issued?
Brent's going to say, I mean, we have certainly great goals, but I'm going to defer to Brent.
Yeah, our plan, Brent Goldberg, CFO, City of Chattanooga. Our plan would be to issue bonds around the beginning of December. We would like to do it no later than December 10th, with a closing date scheduled for early January. That would allow us to get the bonds issued, closed, and start having those funds available for spending by April of 2023. We would like to break ground, and as we mentioned in the previous Sports Authority meeting, we'd like to break ground in April of 23 so that we can have a completion date of April of 25.
Great. Are you all ready to vote on this resolution? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, great. That's passed. Let's actually move to Roman numeral 5, because if my logic is correct, I think we need to approve 5 before 4. So 5 is a resolution to hire PFM as a financial consultant and Bass, Berry and Sims PLC as bond consultant. I move that we discuss resolution 5. Is there a second?
Second.
Great. Staff, again, any background on this? I think members will have questions about this. I certainly do, but it'd be good to hear any background.
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. PFM, Public Financial Management, is the financial advisor of record for both City of Chattanooga and Hamilton County. I've conferred with the CFO at the county, and he tells me that the county agrees with the city that we recommend PFM to be the financial advisor for the Sports Authority. We've got a long-standing history with them. We have a current contract with them at the city, and the county does as well. But as a separate entity, the Sports Authority will need to hire a financial advisor, a public financial advisor, to help with the issuance of bonds, and we fully recommend PFM for that role. And I've notified them that this would potentially be approved by the Sports Authority. And Lauren Lowe, who's our primary representative, can be here at a future Sports Authority meeting to present. But the other item on the agenda, and I'm glad you did it in this order, would be to authorize them to issue an RFP. And based on discussions with PFM, the two options we have for bonds is to do a bid or negotiated sale. In the current market, and because of the nature of the bonds, to build a stadium, it is highly preferential to do a negotiated sale. And to do that, what we would do is do the RFP to identify 4 or 5 major financial institutions that would be interested in this. We've already received interest from JP Morgan, First Horizon, some other large national banks. But the RFP would be done by PFM so that an underwriter can be selected to do a negotiated bond sale with. That's going to give us the best possible rate and structure for this type of bond. So PFM would lead all of those efforts as the financial advisor, and they would work hand in hand with bond counsel. And PFM and Bass, Berry Sims work together on all kinds of projects throughout the state and with bond issuance.
And questions from the members? So this is not required to be a competitive process because you have an existing contract with PFM, as does the county.
Yeah, and one of the attorneys can correct me, but I don't believe the Sports Authority has any requirement to be competitive to hire professional services.
Professional services are exempt under state law as well here under financial issues on there as well. So I don't think that's an issue that you have to worry with. And Bass, Berry and Sims is also the location that Mr. Mamontov, who is sitting behind Mr. Goldberg there, he belongs with them. So that's the reason for their involvement.
And can you provide an approximate cost for these services, and how do they bill? Do they bill per project, per hour?
So the bond counsel and PFM would both invoice their services to be reimbursed through the bond proceeds. So the cost of issuance of bond includes the cost for financial advisory services as well as bond counsel. And the $80 million bond proceeds, it's estimated that approximately $600,000 will go toward bond issuance costs. That's what we've presented to both city council, county commission, and both IDB boards, and that's what's in the public record. That's an approximate amount, but that includes underwriting fees, financial advisory, bond counsel, and everything else.
And PFM is not here today, but Mr. Mamontov, you are. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience, your personal experience with municipal bonds and your firm's experience?
I'd be glad to. I have been doing municipal bond work for 35 years. This sounds very modest, but I'm the most experienced bond attorney in the state now because everyone else is retired. Our law firm does roughly 80 to 85% of the bond issues in the state of Tennessee. We have been involved in essentially every major stadium project in the state. I personally have worked on the baseball stadiums in Jackson, Memphis, the one that's in Sevierville, the Sound Stadium in Nashville, and have helped our Nashville team on all the major stadium projects in Nashville. So I've had a lot of work on not only stadiums, but convention centers and things like that. As you might guess, this is a very niche business, the bond counsel work, and there's really not many people are interested in doing because it's extraordinarily boring. So, that's what I've been doing for a long time. So and of our team, not only do I do a lot of project finance, so it goes beyond just the traditional bond counsel opinion work and assist it with. I wrote the statute on which tax increment financing is done in our state and through industrial development boards, which is a big component of your financing plan. So I wrote that statute for our county in Knox County in 2004. And I've assisted with most of the legislation changes since then. So I have a long history working with tax increment financing, with tax incentives generally, and I do a lot of that kind of work as well.
Mr. Manaman-Toff, are you familiar with the Sports Authorities Act of 1993 as well here, which is in the Tennessee Code?
Yes. I mean, this is an interesting statute. It's a fairly old statute, but we significantly rewrote it when the Titan Stadium came into Nashville to basically create the mechanism that allows this financing to occur. There's a provision in the statute that essentially allows the cities and the county to provide a financial backstop for the bonds through non-property tax revenues. They cannot raise property taxes. I'm going to say that a lot of meetings to pay debt service on your bonds. What they can do is use non-property tax revenues to pay debt service under the Sports Authority statute. The reason it's done that way is to address constitutional concerns about using property tax revenues to pay for a stadium that's leased to a private party. So that's why almost all major financings of stadiums across our state have been done in the same way. That is why you exist. So this harks back to the first Titan Stadium, which we're about to tear down apparently and build another $1 billion something stadium, but and using the same mechanism that you all would be using. But it is a statute that I've worked with, for a long time, and our firm has obviously used it for all the stadiums and arenas in Nashville, which are really the largest financing of this type that have been done.
Yes, sir. And our charter for this entity is in accordance with that statute, correct?
Yes, it is. And
Okay.
Yes, you were formed under the Sports Authority Act, which is, yes, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Great, that's helpful. That's helpful background. Any other questions from the members? Are you ready to vote on this resolution? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Great. So let's move back to Roman numeral 4. Now that we've agreed to hire PFM and Bassberry and Sims as the bond consultant and bond legal consultant, we now want to discuss the vote on authorizing them to issue a request for proposal for bond underwriting services. I move to discuss resolution 4. Is there a second?
Second.
And again, Mr. Vogel, thanks for stepping up. Before we proceed with questions, it'd be great to get some background.
Yeah. So as you can imagine, since the stadium discussion started several months ago, we've been approached, called, emailed by banks all over the country who are interested in being involved in the issuance of bonds for the stadium. We have not spoken to any of these vendors. Instead, we've referred them all to PFM because they are the financial advisor of record, and we have a contract with them. So that's kind of been a holding tank for us, just to send people to them. And it's good for PFM to know who's interested. So these types of projects, PFM has been involved in, not just in Tennessee, but throughout the country. They are a national firm. They have a really good idea of which firms can be the best partner in this type of project. Some banks just don't do this sort of financing. Stadium financing is a little bit different, and they have a good idea of which firms would be the best fit, and especially in a negotiated sale circumstance, which is what is recommended. So what this would allow them to do is to draft and issue an RFP to identify 4 to 5 probably institutions that would be the best fits for issuing these types of bonds. And then they would be able to come back and provide a recommendation with who we should use. I did talk to Lauren this morning. She said that, she can get a draft engagement, once, if you all choose to, well, you already approved hiring PFM, and approve the format or the RFP, they'll get an engagement letter drafted as well as an RFP document so that we can share that before it all goes out. Of course, they won't do anything until an engagement letter is executed, and then they'll provide the draft of the RFP so that all the board members and city staff and whoever else wants to see it can see it. And then they'll get that out and go through that process and, report back to the board and make recommendations and all those sorts of things.
Great. Questions? Will you ask us to, once they issue the RFP, you will ask us to then approve a bond issuer? Or is that something that the city does?
I think the Sports Authority does it, but I think, I think the way we would do it is PFM would recommend someone to be approved.
Great. And then once approved, how is the final pricing of the bond negotiated? And
The authorization would be given to PFM to negotiate with the underwriter.
at a particular range of prices and on a particular day, or how does that work?
I think that's a good discussion for us to have with PFM at a future meeting.
Great. And in general, how have rising interest rates affected the municipal bond market? And if it were to issue today, can you kind of give us a current sense of the yield on the bond and the debt service?
The rates are extremely volatile right now, but I would say anywhere between 4 and 5.75% is what we're looking at currently for municipal bonds. Depending on the bond ratings, like if it's a city or county. For the city's AAA rated, so is the county. That, because we are a backstop, that's going to tremendously help the Sports Authority's ability to get as low of a rate as possible, because they will take that into consideration for these bonds. So I think, like, if the city were to issue bonds currently, we're looking at probably high 4s, maybe early or maybe low 5s. It really just depends on the day and what the bids look like. Of course, we issued bonds in November of 21 for 0.94% total interest cost. So we're in quite a bit different environment than we were then. But interestingly, bond rates are basically back to where they were for a long period of time, right? We were in such a very low period that it obviously was not sustainable. So most of the bonds that we have on our books are in the 4 to 5 range. And we're basically back to the normal, what I would consider normal cost of bonds. In a negotiated sale, the market obviously determines some of the interest rate, but a negotiated sale can also get us a little bit lower than market, because these several financial institutions, especially large financial institutions, national institutions, they want to invest in these types of projects because they've got a certain amount of money set aside for these types of public projects that are what they consider no-brainers for a return on investment.
And if rates continue to rise, is there a price at which it would be too high for you to issue the bond and you would say no?
I don't think so. I think we will get, regardless of how much the rates, well, let me put it this way. Assuming that we issue bonds in December like we would like to issue bonds, when I say we, I mean the Sports Authority, I don't see rates rising fast enough between now and then to get us to a point where we would have to say, no, we can't issue bonds. It would have to get over 6.5%, I think, for us to really want to take a step back and say this is not doable, because as those rates go up, it increases the interest cost, but at the same time, that rate increase should start decreasing inflation, which is going to decrease cost of materials and labor for construction. So, assuming that we have that parity between an increase in rates and a decrease in inflation, the overall cost of the project would be relatively the same. Now, if the Fed keeps raising rates and inflation keeps going up at the same time, that's a much different scenario. But and we are seeing, well, I think the August report just came out, and inflation numbers had not gone down as much as we had hoped, but they have stabilized. So we don't have a continued, meteoric increase in inflation.
And this is a 30-year bond, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. And how did you determine the duration of the bond? Is that based on
So life of
market for
the,
stadiums or the lease or
so there's a couple of reasons for that. One, a 30-year bond gives us the lowest possible debt service payments in the early years. And because this is a TIF finance project, as we've discussed in the public, we don't expect all the new tax increment to come online in the first few years. So the first 2 years, there would be no debt service on these bonds because we would capitalize the interest when we issue the bonds. And that's what we've presented, is to issue bonds with capitalized interest with no debt payments for 2 years. That allows us for 2 years of construction period to get to the end of construction. At that point, we will have tax increment coming online around the stadium because we do expect projects around the stadium, including the core development that we've discussed near the stadium. We expect them to break ground sooner than we break ground on the stadium. So we will have increment that starts coming online within 2 years, but we won't fully have enough increment generated within the TIF area until about the end of year 3, year 4. And then at that point, we will start generating enough increment to fully pay the amount that needs to be paid on the debt service. So part of the reason for that is to have as low as possible debt service payments in the early years. These bonds would be refundable after a certain period of time, likely 10 years. You think more? Yeah. And so once we get to 10 years in, we can evaluate where we are on increment generation from the TIF and refinance the bond so that we could get a shorter period, higher debt service payment. But we definitely want to have lower payments in the early years. Also, the 30-year bond matches the 30-year lease agreement, which also would allow us to capture the sales taxes generated within the stadium for 30 years. So, and the TIF is 30 years. So we wanted to make sure that all of those lined up with the same amount of time, with the option to refinance the bonds, after we get through 10 years.
and once this bond is issued, how should we think about the rating of the bond? Will it be rated and trade based on Chattanooga's bond issuance and creditworthiness, or does it trade as a stadium bond, or how should we think about that?
I'll defer to.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll trade as a combined credit of the county and the city, and basically what they'll look at is the ratios of your non-property tax revenues to the payments on these bonds. My guess from looking at other financial statements, I'm sure Chattanooga and Hamilton County, much the same, the coverage is probably 20-1. It would be a very, very safe investment. Typically, these bonds are rated one notch below the investment grade rating of the city and the county. So if they're both AAA, hopefully we'll get a AA+ rating, and they will largely be tied for the life of the bonds to the ratings of the city and the county. It'll typically be the lower of the two because it's essentially, you don't have one series backed by the county and one series backed by the city. They're both 50-50. And so if one of them got downgraded, then the bonds would be similarly downgraded, even though half of the payments would be at a higher rating. But it's largely tied to the ratings of the city and the county.
And we'll talk about this a little bit later in the discussion, but we have a lot of history of stadium construction in the U.S. over the last 3, 5, 10 years, and bonds have been used for that. Have there been any issues with any of those bonds in terms of where they traded? I doubt there have been any defaults or any issues like that.
There is actually, this is not the case here. I don't want to scare anyone, but I mean, there are situations where suburbs have largely chased large stadiums that have created problems for those suburbs. The most well-known one is in Arizona, where I think it's the hockey team, the Coyotes, maybe, whatever, the NHL team there went into a small suburb, which really could not handle the backstop of the debt service. We are as far away from that here. We're a much smaller amount of money, 2 very strong credits. No disrespect to the city or the county, but any payments they would have to make are pretty much a drop in the bucket in their overall budget, while the community way overstretched themselves to have what they thought was this shiny new object that would bring their community to a new level. So there are communities that have overstretched themselves, and which is true of everything in terms of, like, there is an airport in Arkansas, and then Simply Enterprise that just went into default because they overbuilt their airport. So it can happen, but it is pretty rare. Most stadiums have some indirect backstop from the community, and so as long as you have that and the community can handle the debt, which is certainly the case here, it should never be an issue.
Yeah, just one thing I'll add to that for reference point is even if the city of Chattanooga had to pay the entire debt service payment in any given year, it would represent less than 1% of our operating budget.
And to that point, Mr. Goldberg, Mr. Manitoff, as we get closer to approving the actual bond issuance, I think it would be helpful, and this is going to be a theme actually later in the discussion today when we talk about the lease. I think it would be helpful to present some of those metrics that you talked about before going in, to say, here's our coverage ratio compared to other cities that have issued these bonds. Here's how we think about debt service. That kind of information for us to compare us to other issuers of these types of bonds and where we sit, I think would be very helpful.
Yeah, and I think it would be, it'd be great for us to have PFM do a presentation because they've got a tremendous amount of information that they could use to give you metrics and comparisons.
Any other questions? Secretary Gardner. Hi. Are you ready to vote on this resolution? Yes. All in favor? Aye. All opposed? Those opposed? Great. We now want to discuss resolution 6, a resolution authorizing the execution by the chair or vice chair for the interlocal cooperative agreement reimbursement agreement with the city as to interim expenses. I move that we discuss this resolution. Is there a second? Second. Great. And Jermaine, Mr. Freeman, I think this was actually
Yes. So this is
thought about in discussion of the first one, but please add anything you think you need to add.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as I mentioned before, this resolution allows the Sports Authority to be reimbursed for expenses that it incurs for sort of pre-site work and due diligence work that needs to be provided in preparation for the construction of the stadium, which would happen after the bond issuance. So when we think about due diligence work, we're thinking about geotechnical studies, geotechnical surveys, environmental reports. Those costs are things that we want to go ahead and start doing right now so that we don't lose time and sort of defer that until after the bonds are issued. This allows for the city to reimburse the Sports Authority for the cost of those things, those activities in these coming months, and then for the Sports Authority to reimburse the city through the issuance of the bonds.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Freeman.
Yes, sir.
Any questions from the members? Great. Are you ready to vote on this resolution? All in favor? Aye. Those opposed? Great. Resolution 7 is a resolution to utilize independent legal advice to assist the Sports Authority of the County of Hamilton and the City of Chattanooga on an as-needed basis. I move that we discuss this resolution. Is there a second? Second. And just some background from me on this one. We included this resolution to give us, the Sports Authority members, the ability to draw on outside legal advice in the future. We don't have any plans to do that now, but issues may come up where we would like to have an independent legal view. We have a very experienced legal counsel for the authority, Mr. Phil Noblet, who's up here with us. We'll also be working on the bond, or the city will be working on the bond issuance with Mr. Mamontoff and Bass Berry. But we do want at least the ability and the authorization to call an outside counsel around issues that where we see fit and as appropriate. And that could be around the bond, it could be around the lease, it could be around the construction agreement, it could be around a master development. There could be other issues as well. Mr. Freeman, any other comments?
The only thing that I would add is it is not uncommon for governmental authorities to seek external legal counsel for complex and complicated issues. The city does that on a regular basis. We have a resolution that we approve through City Council that lists the law firms that we use for transactional issues and transactional matters, which Attorney Noblick can give you more information about. But having said that, again, this is not uncommon, and we certainly, as the city, would encourage the Sports Authority to seek whatever legal counsel you deem necessary.
Any questions from the members? Are you ready to vote on this resolution? All in favor? Aye. Those opposed? Great. Well, I think those are the resolutions and the votes. We now want to have a discussion about a couple of different topics. We'll begin with discussion of the basics of the lease agreement and primary documents related to the lease. The Sports Authority does not have a lease to review at this point. We haven't seen a draft lease, nor should we want to see one at this point. But we want to have this discussion today as an education session on what a stadium lease looks like, what elements are covered in a stadium lease, how it'll be organized, the main issues that we as a Sports Authority need to consider in approving this lease document. The lease document is one of the most important documents related to this project, and it's one of the most important documents we'll be asked to review and approve. So I will turn it over to the staff to begin the discussions, and then we will have some questions.
So Brent and I will tag team here, and we will ask Mr. Mamontoff to add any additional detail. The primary thing that we want to sort of voice is, as we go through this process, what we have always said, and what Mr. Fryer from the Lookouts has already committed to, and what is well known in the public record, is that this lease will have a lease payment that will require $1 million a year from the team. With that, that is a 30-year time period, and it will, or the term will be for 30 years, and it would include an escalator. I will ask my colleague, Brent, to come up to talk a little bit about naming rights, as well as parking revenue. And then we can talk a little bit about licenses with Major League Baseball here in just a second. So I'll ask Brent to come up and share a little bit of information there.
Yeah, so one thing that's come up as we've debated this in the public for the past several months is the structure of the lease in general. And it can be done various ways. The owner of the Lookouts has done it different ways in different cities, and they've also consulted on projects in other cities as well. For example, in other cities, they may put money into the project up front, which would be considered prepaid rent, and then they either have no or very little rent payments over the life of the lease. What we decided early on is that we thought it would be better to have lease payments each year for the 30-year duration of the TIF, so that we have annual security for a portion of the bond proceeds, the bond debt service. So what we're proposing, and what we've proposed before, is that we have a lease that starts with a $1 million a year lease payment, and has an escalator until a certain level of development is reached in the TIF area. So that means we would have a minimum of $30 million in debt payments, lease payments from the lease agreement to service debt from the bonds. The parking is something that we would still need to work on and settle on exact details. But generally, what we've agreed on in preliminary conversations is that we would have 100% of the parking revenues go toward debt service for the first 2 years, and then it would convert to 70% to debt service for the following 2 years, and then split 50-50 after that. So
70-30 goes to
30 would go to the team. Typically the team, operates parking around the stadium, and they, keep all the revenue from it. But this is something in our discussions that we talked about to help us on that very front end of the TIF, so that we have additional revenue coming into the TIF, or coming in to make payments on the bond. So 100% for 2 years, 70% for the next 2, and then it would split 50-50 after that. The team would have naming rights to all advertising within the stadium, which is pretty standard and something that is just needed for the team to be able to have a pro forma that, would be viable for any financial institution, because that is their primary source of fixed revenues versus variable. And it allows them, it takes away management of advertising and naming rights and all those sorts of things from the sports authority, and lets them do it and manage all of that and earn the revenues as well as bear the expenses that go with it. Another big component is that the team would be responsible for normal maintenance of the stadium, which is estimated about $1.5 million per year. And that's, in terms of today's dollars, and that's based on what maintenance costs are for other similar stadiums. So with the $30 million in lease payments plus $1.5 million a year in maintenance costs, we're looking at, a minimum of $75 million in costs that the team would be bearing over a 30-year lease term.
Questions?
When you say 1.5 million in maintenance costs annually, how is that, what does that look like? Is it a required amount to spend?
No, the lease will just specify that they have to maintain the stadium for normal maintenance and probably identify, what generally describe what normal maintenance is. That would not be like a roof replacement. It wouldn't be a HVAC replacement. It is a publicly owned stadium, but we would expect them to do, to have normal maintenance of the stadium throughout the year. And that could be everything from groundskeeping to landscaping to painting to, just normal maintenance.
Other questions? I'd like to keep this discussion at a pretty high level today. We'll get into more details as you develop your negotiations.
Okay.
But you did mention two things I would like to ask about. One, the escalator tied to CPI, or what is it tied to? And second, you mentioned the escalator comes off at a certain stage of development. Could you describe that a bit?
Yeah. So what we talked about in the preliminary discussions is that the escalator would be instead of tying it to anything, just set it at 1.5% per year. That way, it gives us a more fixed amount that would be available for servicing the debt rather than a variable amount. And then the escalator would freeze, or the amount of rent would freeze at such time that the development breaks even from tax increment to pay the debt service. So those were the things that Mayor Kelly in particular wanted us to include in the lease agreement. And so we've had preliminary discussions with the team regarding those provisions.
Phil?
Yeah, just letting you know that at y'all's request, we provided access to a number of other lease agreements throughout the South here at this point in time that would be included. I think we've got 13 different ones in a Dropbox for y'all to review at this point in time, and you can compare that whenever we start getting the opportunity to review the lease agreements.
And thanks for that, Mr. Noblet. It's one of the topics I wanted to talk about just in general in this discussion. We are a citizen committee here. I don't think any of us have had any experience negotiating a stadium lease in our lives. I doubt in our future lives we'll have experience negotiating a stadium lease. So this is not negotiating or approving. You all will be negotiating it. And we're negotiating a lease with a group that has done this for a living. And that's part of their job. So that's part of their regular business. So they have, in my view at least, an information advantage over the city and over us. We've been on the jobs for 7 days so far. So one of the things I want to do, and Phil refers to it, is we want to narrow that information advantage as much as possible. And we really recommend that the city think about this. And as I said, this lease, I think, will be one of the most important documents of this process and one of our most important decisions. So when the time, one way to level the playing field is to draw on this larger source of public lease documents that are out there.
Yes.
Mr. Noblet referred to it. There's been an explosion of stadium building in the U.S. over the last 5, 10, 15 years. Those lease documents are public documents. And we have, I think at the same time, Knoxville is in the process of negotiating a lease. So they are doing it contemporaneously with us. I believe even that draft document is a public document. So when it comes time to discuss the lease and approve the lease, whether it is a preliminary discussion or an approval discussion, I would really recommend to the city staff to not only present the lease and how you feel about it and what you have done and argue for why it's a good lease, but to present that lease in context and comparison against the body of stadium leases that are out there, which is the reason I asked the staff to pull together these documents. Now, we all realize no one stadium is the same. No set of negotiations are the same. Leases will vary, but we would like to see, and I think we'll be very clear about this, what is the same in the lease compared to the variety of other leases that are out there? What is different? Why is it different? What did we receive in terms of, could be seen a beneficial term that someone else received? What did we not receive that could be seen as a beneficial term that others received? And put that into a matrix to have a discussion about the market terms for a stadium lease and really work to convince us that this is straight down the middle. This is a market lease. These are the types of leases you see in markets. Now, there will be all kinds of addendums to that, and there'll be reasons why things are different, but none of us have experience approving a stadium lease, and we're not operating in a vacuum. And we'd really like to draw on that wide amount of knowledge out there, particularly against working with a group that has a lot of experience in that area.
Yeah, if I may, Mr. Chair, just a couple of things. One, I do think that's one of the benefits of having Bassberry Sims on board with the sports committee, because they do have, as a law firm, and Mark personally has experience negotiating these types of leases. But they also have the firm is a large firm that has a lot of capacity as well. The other thing I would say is, we do have the advantage of utilizing the publicly available information from Knoxville, because they are quite a few months ahead of us on this, and they've done quite a bit of work. I think the two most important parts of that, because the terms are going to be, the terms that will vary by city include the length of the lease, the amount of rent payment, what's maintenance, those sorts of things that are, there's probably half dozen things that will be varied between the cities that we can do a comparison on. But the important things in the lease are the legal mechanisms included in the lease agreement, especially the fact that Knoxville has negotiated a lease that includes language that was negotiated with Major League Baseball, and it's the first such lease that exists since Major League Baseball took over operations of the minor leagues. So I think that's really important, because we don't have to recreate the wheel for that. We can utilize that same language because it is allowed to be used in future leases. And then there's one down the street and near Huntsville. That's a fairly recent one as well, that I think it's pre-Major League Baseball taking over the minor league structure, but it still gives us a really good example, especially for a stadium that is in proximity and not in Tennessee. I mean, we're really lucky to have another lease agreement just up the road in Tennessee, because it also complies with Tennessee law.
Yeah, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Also, to that point, if you do choose to use an existing lease as a template to say, we don't need to reinvent, well, let's start here with our negotiations, I think it'd be very helpful to us to see a red line of that lease to what you're proposing that we approve, in addition to the matrix on all the other leases. I've done a very cursory review of several of those leases, and there is a lot of differentiation on topics of parking, environmental and community benefits agreements, and naming rights, and lots of different things. So I think we need to find what is best for Chattanooga, and we need to find a very good market term and feel very comfortable with approving the 30-year lease.
Yeah. Only other thing I'll mention is that at $1 million per year, it'll be one of the richest lease agreements in the country, which that alone, I think, is a benefit for Chattanooga. And I just want to make sure to mention that publicly.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Or thoughts, or any other comments about the lease? Mr. Mann, talk to.
Man, just one
Yes.
quick thing,
Oh,
because
sure.
if you all start looking at the leases, I agree with everything all of you all said. It's so important. As you're going to hear me talk a lot about this over the next few months, is that any payments from private entities will result in taxable bonds. So the $1 million rent payment from the team, we will have to tie a series of bonds that are going to be roughly at a 30% higher interest rate because it's payable from a private payment source. To the extent the bonds are payable from tax increment revenues, from any revenues provided by the city or the county, or from the sales tax revenues that we receive from the special state legislation, those are public sources or funds. So roughly in Knoxville, it's going to be, say, 75% tax exempt, 25% taxable. So if you look at the Madison lease, which I think is a really good lease to look at because it's the most recent signed lease in what they used to call the Southern League, they renamed it. But if you look at that lease, what is it? Oh, we're back again? Thank you, Jason. I did not know that. So he corrected me. Good. So we're now the Southern League again, so I can be the thing. So if you look at that lease, it is a revenue sharing lease, where the city could argue that it got more of the upside. As a result, though, they had to issue a lot more taxable debt because they had to tie it to taxable payments. So whenever you say, oh, why don't we take the naming rights? Why don't we do? There's business reasons why you may not want to do that, but it's going to raise your interest costs. When interest rates were extraordinarily low, as Brent described for the city last year, people didn't care that much. They could pay a little bit more for taxable debt. Now that your rates are looking in the 4% range, 30% of 4% adds up. And so that is a pretty big difference between tax exempt and taxable debt. So as you're looking at these leases, keep in mind the revenue quote sharing deals. If you look at the soccer stadium lease, the most recent lease in Nashville, the MLS lease, it's a fully guaranteed lease by the team. MLS economics are totally different. And I'm sure Jason would tell you this from minor league baseball, but they issued $200 million of taxable debt. If they had to do that at roughly 2% interest, if they had to do that today, it'd probably be 5.5% interest. And so it's a big difference as you look. And so make sure as you're thinking through those leases that there are trade-offs is in anything in life or any aspect of these leases.
And related to that point, I think, and Mr. Goldberg, you all may have done some modeling already, but as we get closer to the lease coming together, and also thinking about construction agreements and timing and the bond issuance, and we know more about the debt service and the interest rate of the bond, it would be helpful for us to see some modeling, some financial modeling of things coming online, the taxes coming in, debt service being paid, the revenue coming in from the lease and other sources. So I think that would be helpful to see, particularly given what Mr. Manitoff said in this higher interest rate environment, where the margins may be thinner.
Yeah, definitely. And we've of course done preliminary stuff, which has been included in our public presentations and the one that we presented at the last Sports Authority meeting. And we will adjust that to be, as current as possible. And also we can start projecting, once now that we've gotten to the point we are now, people realize that, we're getting closer and closer to actually issuing bonds and breaking ground. We're going to have a much better idea of when other projects will break ground and when they expect to come online, which will help us project the incremental revenues that are coming in. But I'll just be very clear about this one thing. We are not issuing bonds for more than $80 million, period. We've said that. We've said that in every meeting we've been in, every question we've been asked. We're not to exceed $80 million. We're not coming back and asking for 82 or 83 or 84. It's $80 million. If interest rates bring us our capitalized interest cost up higher than what we originally projected, if our bond issuance costs are higher than originally projected, that means we're decreasing the amount available for construction. We'll have to see what that looks like. Construction costs are starting to level out. We do think we'll start seeing some benefit with decreased material costs, perhaps even some decreased labor cost. But we'll go out and ask for a design for the most expensive, best stadium you could ever have in the world, right? Probably has a roof on it, retractable, everything. We take that design and then we work our way down to what the budget is, which is very similar to what they've done in Knoxville. We have a lot more flexibility here than they do in Knoxville because we have a larger site and we don't have to do as much vertical building and those sorts of things. But but we are going to figure it out within that 80 million in terms of Sports Authority bonds being issued.
Thank you, Mr. Fuller. Any other questions? Okay, nothing to vote on there. And then the other discussion item is about member interest in committees. The background here, and I asked this to be placed on the agenda, is over the course of the next several weeks and months, we are all going to consider a series of very complicated questions and decisions. This is a large project, it's a complicated project, it's an important project. It's a project with a lot of moving parts. And so we thought it'd be a good idea to assign members of the Sports Authority some areas of specialization. We focused on 3 areas. Glad to consider more if folks have ideas. These will not, to be clear, be separate committees. We will act as a committee of the whole. These committees will not be meeting separately, but we would like the people who are assigned to these areas to be a source of expertise and questions during our discussion. So I would welcome volunteers for any of these 3 positions. There are 3 committees that are listed in the agenda. We have 3: community engagement, someone to really focus on and be the point person a bit with questions and other information on finance and bond issuance, and then someone to really help focus on the leasing and on the construction. So do I have any volunteers?
Community engagement.
Great. Secretary Varner, thank you. And by the way, it's not that we only need 1 person for each of these. So if you want to have dual heads of these committees, that is absolutely fine. The other 2, and if we don't have suggestions, I will not be shy in nominating people.
I will help Edna. I'm interested in the construction part on number 3, not necessarily the leasing, but I mean, I may by that time know so much more by that time. But,
Great.
But I am very interested in. the
Okay,
community
well, we're happy to have you both focus on that, Reverend Weeks.
Put me with Edna.
And I would like to work in leasing and
Okay,
construction.
great. That would be great. I thought that was a good fit for you, Mr. Foster. Thank you. Matt, that leaves you for finance and bond issues. It's okay.
You mean to take that?
Yes.
Okay.
That'd be great. Super. Mr. Nobelet, I don't think we need to vote on that, or do we?
Not at this point, as long as you have volunteers.
Great.
And you'll see if someone doesn't want to volunteer anymore, I guess.
Okay, great.
Yes, sir.
Great. And then in terms of other business, the final agenda item is, as Mr. Nobelet mentioned, Mr. Goldberg mentioned, we sent out a very thick information packet that the staff put together, and thank you all for doing that, to the members of the Sports Authority. Following the first meeting, I thought it was very important for everyone to have as much information that's publicly available on this project as possible. So there's some very good information in there. The city actually has a very, very good website on the entire South Side project. And if any of you have not looked at it, I recommend that you do so. And then a number of different documents, the Younger study, a variety of different studies. So everyone has that in their hands. I trust everyone has read that package. Really just wanted to see, while we're in meeting, we have the staff here, if you have any questions with any of that information for the staff that you wanted to raise.
I'm happy to answer
Yes,
any
Mr.
questions.
Freeman?
No, I was just going to say I'm happy to answer any questions that the board may have. We do the website that the chairman has referenced is the website that I think most of you are familiar with, southbroad.info. It does cover a lot of information related to this project from start to where we are now, in addition to providing all of the documents and resolutions that have been passed by both the county commission, the city council, the Hamilton County Sports Authority Board, as well as the city of Chattanooga. I'm sorry, the Hamilton County Industrial Development Board, as well as the city of Chattanooga's Industrial Development Board. All of those documents are on there. The sort of backstory about the site is on there, as well as a map of the TIF district that was approved by both the Hamilton County and the city of Chattanooga, and to our CFO's point, sort of the breakdown of the costs. We're very proud of the work that has gone into putting that website together. As Mr. Goldberg stated, we have no intention of issuing more than $80 million in terms of bonds for the cost of the stadium, and all of those costs are broken down, as well as sort of our reasoning for why we created the TIF district that we did. It is important to note that I would share with this board that the city of Knoxville and Knox County actually recently had to go back to expand their TIF districts as part of their projects. And we do not anticipate having to do that because we created a district that we think and that the county was supportive of that will is sufficient to help us get this over the finish line. So, but I am happy to answer any questions that people may have.
Any questions? Great. Well, thank you all for pulling together the information. Thanks for all your work to the staff. And if there are no other questions or business, I move that we adjourn the meeting. Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Great. Thank you all very much.
All right, made it through too.
Yeah.
All right.